Good evening. We are in Matthew chapter 6. I'll show we left off at verse 24. Did anybody have any questions about the previous couple of verses dealing with the single eye and if your eye is good? I know we were running out of time when I covered that. I didn't want to go back and rehash it if it was clear, but at the same time, I know we're kind of running out of time, and so we hit that little part probably a little quicker than we might otherwise have, but we good on that? All right. See if I can get this thing to stay on here. All right, let's go to, we didn't quite finish, we didn't cover verse 24. That was kind of where we ran out of time. But verse 24 is not really a whole lot to say. It's one of those verses that doesn't need a whole lot of explaining. It needs a whole lot of obeying because he says you can't serve two masters. You hate the one, love the other, or you hold to the one and despise the other. Can't serve God and mammon. The mammon reference there is a reference to what sometimes is called the god of money, the god of finances. That's an idolatrous thing, and he's that connects it here with the context of finances. And I think we pointed that out with 22 and 23, right? That's also connected in that sense, but there's a broader application as well, and that's what I want us to remember. This begins there in verse 19, single treasure, as you recall we pointed out last week, single eye, and that's, we use the illustration, it's kind of more or less what the illustration that Jesus is using, having an eye for investment, not, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, but spiritual investment. And that's what's being discussed here. So where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And of course, then the two verses about the light of the eye, if your light, if the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? Can't serve two masters. You gotta pick a side. And as we often say, the devil, he owns the fence. So you can't serve two masters. Again, the mammon reference connects it to finances, but it's anything. You just can't serve two masters. So that's a pretty plain verse. Then he goes on into verses 25 through really to the end of the chapter, and he's going to talk about worry. I was looking back at my sermon notes from when we studied through the Sermon on the Mount on Sunday mornings. This was, I don't have dates on these. I was trying to remember what year it was. I just looked them up in my files. I didn't pay attention to the date. I think it was like 2014, 2015, so it's been a little while. But we broke this down in that study as information in verse 25, illustrations, verses 26 through 30. So he's going to give some information there in verse 25, and this one is another one of those that's pretty self-explanatory. He says, don't take any thought for your life, what you'll eat, what you'll drink, nor yet for your body what you shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment or clothing. So he says, don't worry. And then he's going to give illustrations. He's going to give birds, flowers, grass, uses those as illustrations of this principle of not worrying, that God is going to take care of his people. God's going to look after his people. And then the third section here, verses 31 through 34, deal with instruction. He's going to give some further instruction here about worry. Looking at my father-in-law's notes here and seeing what all he's got. He mentions that the King James has take thought or take no thought. Yeah, take no thought. There's a typo in here. But it's translated as be anxious, don't be anxious. American Standard Version has. Don't worry, the New King James says. I think I like anxious the best of those if I were to pick. If you were to just say, hey, which is, and that's not necessarily from a technical standpoint of translating the exact Greek word, but it's the idea of what it's conveying. He obviously doesn't mean just literally take no thought, because if you didn't think about any of those things, how would you How would you have any of those needs met, right? So you have to take thought in one sense, but you don't want to be anxious. You know, we said before, concern is you're going out of town, you lock the front door, right? Anxiety, worry, at least in the sense that Jesus is talking about here, would be you can't even enjoy your trip because you're constantly worried about, is somebody breaking in the house? Is everything getting stolen? And you just can't even, almost can't function on this trip because all you think about is back home, what's going on? So there's a difference in worry and care or concern, and we need to understand that. Concern is buckling your seatbelt. Worry or anxiety is you're just driving down the road and you're constantly a nervous wreck because, you've read the statistics, people have wrecks, and people who have had wrecks and serious wrecks, and what if it happens to me? And you see what I'm saying? It becomes crippling. Worry, though, is a universal problem. People have pointed this out numerous times. People of all races, people of all nations, the rich sometimes worry, the poor sometimes worry. Do men worry? Certainly. Do women worry? They do. What about children? Do they ever get worried about stuff? Yeah. What about adults? Yes, adults worry. Do non-Christians worry and get concerned? Yes. Do Christians worry and get concerned? Yes, they do. It's a universal problem. And so this is one of those passages that there's nobody out there that can say, you know what, I don't have to worry about this. This doesn't apply to me. Jesus is talking to somebody else. We all have to deal with it. And so again, it's different from being concerned. There are things that would fall under the umbrella of concern or precaution that they're wise and they're healthy. Is it good to be concerned about health and say, oh, I want to try to eat better or maybe get more exercise or whatever? That's a good thing. That would be concern. But if you become obsessed over that to the point that it begins to control your life, to the point that it begins to take precedence over spiritual matters, now you got a problem. That becomes kind of what Jesus is talking about here. So, again, got to make that distinction because sometimes people, they read this passage and they say, well, I worry all the time, and so-and-so, he's a worrywart, she's a worrywart, and, and almost like we just dismiss it as if it's the thing that Jesus talks about that, he didn't really mean it because everybody does that. Well, there's a difference in concern and worry. We got to make sure we understand that. Now, listen, even when it gets into the realm of worry, understand that's still a challenge for us, isn't it? Now, some more so than others. We studied personalities. I don't know, that's probably been 2 or 3 years ago. But hopefully you saw that as you understand those personalities and hopefully understand your own personality, that there's a lot of that goes into driving a more carefree type of spirit and mentality versus a person who tends to worry more, right? And you see that maybe in yourself, maybe in other folks. There's a difference, and a lot of personality comes into that. But again, as we pointed out in that class, you can't just say, well, that's just, I'm a more melancholy personality, and so that's just how God made me. I'm just a worrier. No, that's not. Jesus doesn't say, take no thought. Well, unless that's kind of more your personality, then it's okay. There are strengths and weaknesses with every personality type. And so we try to build on our strengths. We try to work on the weaknesses. But worry is, I was looking for it. I had a quote in here that I wanted to read. Oh, worry is the wringing of the hands that comes from a what am I going to do mentality. Worry eats at one's insides and prohibits him or her from having peace of mind. I like that definition. That's in Papaw's notes, Reagan's dad, and I don't know if there's no quote, so I suppose that's from him. So, Jesus says there's no need to worry because life consists of more than material stuff. I have said this to people so many times over the past year and even over the past, 2, 3, 4 weeks. If I didn't have a heavenly hope, I'd probably lose my mind. Because, look at the past year. All this stuff with COVID-19 and a lockdown and then an election that was just an unprecedented amount of mail that now you're stuck at home and you gotta go get all that mail. I tell you, one guy who was never out of a job during all that was Trash Man. But all this, and then you look sometimes at the country and whoever your political candidate is, there's no denying that when executive orders and things like that are signed, that allot taxpayer money to fund abortion and put in some of the highest positions in our country, people that are flaunting and living just an open, in-your-face type of sin, that's discouraging sometimes. And sometimes Christians can really get to wringing their hands over that. But what Jesus says here is, life's more than material stuff. That's what we pointed out before. It doesn't mean we just kind of, I don't care about that. Doesn't mean you don't care. Doesn't mean you're not concerned. Doesn't mean you don't take action when and where you can, such as the voting booth. But it means I don't have to be wringing my hands over that. I don't have to lose my mind over that because God's in control. And this world, as we often sing, is not my home. I read this quote to you once before, but I love it. It's so true. And I can't find a source for it. If you know it, share it with me, and I'll give proper credit. But it said, "Blessed is the man who is too busy to worry in the daytime and too sleepy to worry at night." Sometimes we need to slow down our lives. Sometimes we just get too busy, and I recognize that. And we need to be aware of that and cautious about that. But is it not the case that sometimes we worry because we just have too much time on our hands, because we're not about the Father's business? We're not busy in the kingdom of our Lord. My grandmother on my mom's side, she was a worrier. And a lot of times it was concern, but a lot of times it got into the realm of just exactly what Jesus is talking about here. And I'm convinced to this day that much of it was because, bless her, she was retired, which she'd always been a stay-at-home mom. And then she was a stay-at-home grandmom. She kept grandkids for some of the granddaughters that worked. And she would keep me sometimes. She lived just down the road from us. And, some of us would get a little too old for her to be necessarily babysitting. Sometimes we'd go down there just so she could keep an eye on us. But then here would come another younger batch, and she'd watch them. But she'd always stayed at home. Well, then Granddaddy died, and that left a lot of extra time on her hands. And at that time, she didn't have any grandbabies that she was watching. And I think a lot of it was she had that time on her hands, and she would just drive herself sometimes into a frenzy thinking of all these scenarios of everything that could go wrong. And it was very difficult to, you say, "Grandmother, you can't think like that. You got to," and again, some of that was her personality, and she, I do think she tried to work on it. But sometimes we just, again, there's a blessing in being too busy to, it's almost like I don't have time to stop and worry during the daytime. I'm too sleepy to worry at night. Sometimes worries can keep us awake at night if we're not careful. But again, more to life than this, the material things. Yes, sir.
It's interesting because at face value, this is a challenge. If you've got bills to pay, if you've got medical scenarios, but he's not going to leave it at that. Now, I'm not going to try to jump ahead, but he's going to say, "I'm giving you evidence." You're going to be able to open your eyes and see things that relieves your worries.
Yeah.
And I think the complementary verse is Romans 1:20. It says the invisible things are clearly seen by those things that are made. Now that's the proof of God and His existence, is by looking at the things that are made. And you just watch, you're going to get there here in a moment. He's going to say, look, the evidence for you not worrying is what you can clearly see with your own eyes.
Yeah, that's right. And that's, in fact, let's just go ahead and go into those next verses here, because that's what he's going to do with these illustrations. It's almost like, a lot of times in our Sunday night studies that we've done with the steps towards spiritual maturity, in several of those I like to do case studies, as I call them. And that's kind of what Jesus does here. You want a case study? In that worry. You got critters that don't worry, and God takes care of them. And so he says, look at the fowls of the air, the birds. They don't sow. They don't reap. They don't gather into barns, and yet God's feeding them. Hey, are you not much better than they are? And then he goes on and he says, which of you by taking thought can add 1 cubit unto his stature? Do y'all remember, well, I know some of you do, but the younger ones may not, but probably even young adult age remember Dr. Phil. I don't know if he's still around. He used to be a big, popular, I guess what do you call it, like a talk show type similar thing. My dad drove me crazy with Dr. Phil. I think he secretly wanted to be Dr. Phil and be on his own show and dispensing advice and stuff. But anyways, he loved Dr. Phil, and maybe he still watches old reruns. I don't know. But I remember because sometimes if I was, it was right around the time I was out of preaching school, but I'd gone back to college, and I was way too intelligent to be listening to Dad at that time. I've told you before, he got a lot smarter between 20, 25 years old. But he would sometimes, ask me about something, and I'd be broke as a joke, usually because I'm just blowing money, and he'd start talking about, I won't hear that, Daddy. Don't tell. And he'd say, and sometimes I'd say, I got this figured out. I'm going to do such and such. And he'd say, well, you know what Dr. Phil says. How's that working for you? I'd say, go on, leave me alone. But that was kind of a favorite expression of his, if you ever watched that show. And he would sometimes say that to people. They're doing this, or maybe this is their plan, they're going to solve all their problems, or maybe this is how they're dealing with that relationship. Well, I tell him all the time, and he's like, how's that working? And I tease and say I got so annoyed with that guy, and he is annoying sometimes, but that actually is it's a pretty smart thing to say sometimes. And the really wise people will sometimes take a step back in their own lives and say, okay, here's what I'm doing in regard to a problem, to a situation. Here's my plan in regard to a problem or a situation. How's that working? And sometimes you just need to take a step back. So it's almost like Jesus says here, so you want to grow to be 6, 7 feet tall. Just think about it real hard and you'll grow, right? How's that working for you? Worry about it a lot and see. Some people, I'm too short. Some people say, I'm too tall. Some people say, I'm too fat. I'm too skinny. Well, let me tell you, go home tonight and really work yourself into an emotional frenzy about it. And come back and tell us, how's that working for you? Well, save yourself the trouble. Jesus says, can't do it. You're not going to be able to think, and add a cubit. Of course, cubit is a measurement. It's about somewhere around 18 inches. But you're not going to just be able to think and grow any taller or lose weight or gain weight or be shorter. So, why take your thought for raiment? Now, here's your second illustration. Consider the lilies of the field. Third illustration, the flowers. Look how they grow. They don't toil, neither do they spin. They're not working hard to make themselves pretty garments. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And what a comparison, right? But he says, if God so clothed the grass of the field, which today is, tomorrow is cast into the oven, is he not going to take care of you? The grass, the flowers, the animals, those are not immortal things. He says they're here today, gone tomorrow. Animals don't have a soul. When they're dead, they're gone. Humans have a soul that lives on eternally. If God's doing that for them, is he not going to be much more concerned with humans, and especially his children that have that special relationship with him? Yes, sir.
Doesn't it deal with the idea of trust? He's trying to build their trust in God's promises.
Yes.
And that he'll fulfill what he says he's going to do.
Yes. And one of the sad realities that we've learned in the last few years is that, and not that we didn't know it before, but just learned it in a different way, I guess a little more up close and personal, is that not every child has a father or mother that's looking out for them the way they should be. But assuming you have a parent who is, understanding parents are fallible, but they're striving to do what's best for the child. I think about growing up. My parents, certainly not perfect, but they were great parents. And, I never once as a child woke up and thought, oh no, what am I going to do today? How am I going to manage to keep the power on? I mean, here we are. It's February. It's, of course, not very cold today, but it's cold weather. What are we going to do? I'm really worried about this. I never thought that. I never thought, what am I going to do about supper tonight? How am I going to I don't know how to cook. What am I going to do? I never worried about that. You know why? Because I knew. And if somebody even come up to me and tried to get me to worry about those things, man, Chad, are you not concerned? I mean, have you ever cooked a meal? Well, no, I never really have. Well, I mean, does that not concern you? What are you going to do for supper? I don't know. Mama's going to take care of that. I don't have to worry about it. Well, I mean, what about shelter? I mean, you don't ever think about it. What if a storm comes through and takes out your house? Well, yeah, I mean, that could happen. But I know one thing, Daddy he'll take care of us. He'll get us somewhere if we had to move in with family for temporary time or whatever. He'll take care of it. I didn't worry about those things. And so, yeah, you're right, Robert. That's a very good point. That it all gets back to trust. He's trying to impress upon God's children, you are just that. You're God's children. So trust your Father. The old saying, work like it all depends on you. And trust in God, pray to God, like it all depends upon Him. He's not saying just throw your hands up and don't do anything. But He's saying trust in God. And so then He goes on verse 31, and this begins that third section with instruction. He says, therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? Wherewithal shall we be clothed? And he reminds them, after all these things do the Gentiles seek, these people who are not God's people, for your heavenly Father knoweth that you have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. A lot of times when I quote that verse in sermons or in other contexts, I will clarify. I'll say, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things, the material needs of life, shall be added unto you. Because I think sometimes if we're not careful, people quote that verse and they think that God is telling them, well, you just seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and everything else is going to be added unto you. No, that's not what He said. This is not, Joel Osteen preaching here. This is Jesus. Yeah, that's kind of the idea of some of the health and wealth, prosperity gospel people. Oh, you just seek God. You put Him first, and man, you're going to have material blessings, you're going to have wealth, and you're going to have this. Now, He's never promised that. He's promised a heavenly home. He never said nothing bad will ever happen in your life. And we got to be careful with that, because it'll really shake us if and when, not if, when bad things happen. Because the devil's still active in this world. This world is still fallen. God didn't say, look, no suffering if you'll just be my child. You will never, ever be in poverty, guaranteed. And you know what else? Let me throw in to boot. You will live to X number of years old, as long as you're putting me first. And when something bad happens, tragedy strikes, then it can really shake us. And sometimes even people, in fact, a former classmate of mine posted on 2 or 3 Facebook groups that I'm on, a lady he's been trying to study with and work with, and he's kind of discouraged himself, because he says, I don't know what else to do to help this lady, but she's had a lot of tragedy in her family and in her life, and the statement he made was that she would make the Lemony Snicket family look like they've had a pretty easy life. But one of the things that she's going through is she blames herself. What am I doing wrong that God is punishing me with all this? And he's trying to get across to her, that's not how this works. God didn't promise, well, if you're faithful, nothing bad will ever happen. And if you start believing that, then when bad things do happen, you start to think, well, somewhere along the way, I'm not following God. This lady, he said she honestly believes she's been cursed by God. How sad. So we got to understand what he's talking about here with all these things are the material needs of life. Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Well, you've got enough to worry about today without worrying about tomorrow, right? That's what, I don't remember if that was my grandmother, another grandmother, not the worrier. she worried about today and tomorrow. But I'm trying to remember. I don't know if that was a grandmother, but somebody, it seems like in my family, it used to say that all the time. And that's where the idea comes from, is right there in Matthew 6, verse 34. What do people worry about? People worry about a lot of things. Some people worry about everything, right? But I've got a list here in Roger's notes of several things that people worry about. They're kind of in a generic sense. People worry about things that have already happened. Isn't that something? People worry over the past. And, again, to borrow from Dr. Phil, how's that working for you? Has it changed the past? It'll never change the past, right? If you made mistakes in the past and they're covered by the blood of Jesus, move on. He's forgotten them. Why should you be hanging on to that and worrying over it? If others have wronged you and they've made that right, even if they haven't made it right, worrying over it doesn't do anything. Do what you can, and after that, pray about it. But there's no sense in worrying about the past. People worry, number 2, about things that are unavoidable. How many people worry about getting older? You ever worry about getting older? How's it working for you? Is it slowing down time? Nope. Time marches on, doesn't it? Some people worry about losing their hair. I heard a friend of mine, I think it was Brent, had a sermon called, he shared it with me one time, it was called Worry Ain't Rogaine. It's not going to put hair on your head. But people worry so much about that. I mean, people worry about dying, don't they? Is it going to stop it? It's appointed unto man wants to die, Hebrews 9:27. So people worry about things that are unavoidable. Well, what's the point? You can't worry about it. I mean, you can't avoid it. You can't stop it. Why worry over it? People worry, number 3, about things that never happen. I don't know. I saw a survey or something one time that gave the statistics. It was an overwhelming amount, though, percentage of this category. People worrying about things that never even happen. I mean, have you ever worried about something? I'm telling you, I have wrung my hands before about an upcoming meeting. In fact, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but I'm going to say this. When we were, let me say it this way. I have to be careful. I have worked with congregations before where if the leadership said, hey, are you available Sunday night after service for a quick meeting? Or Wednesday night after service for a quick meeting? Then you knew what's going on. Something's up. They're going to get on to me about something. And I've told our elders this before, but not long after we came to Bremen. We came July 1st. We had 2 weeks of camp, and I think that year, the second week, we missed VBS because we'd already been committed to Camp McCroy. But so I guess it would have been the next year, but it was after VBS. The elders asked me one day, said, hey, you got a minute to meet? Or I think they told me a couple days in advance, and I said something to Reagan about, okay, now, keep in mind Sunday night I'll be meeting with the elders after services, whatever. And she says, why? What's going on? I said, I don't know. They just said they want to meet with me. Well, what do they want to meet about? Did they say? No, they didn't say. She said, well, that's not good. And I said, okay. And I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I was a little bit concerned myself. And so I get in there and I meet with the elders, and I kind of go in there and I'm a little bit apprehensive. And you know what they said? What'd you think about VBS? And I said, what do you mean? What'd you think about VBS? I said, I liked it. And they said, do you think everything went well? I said, yeah. Did something go wrong? They said, no, we just wondered what you thought about it. And I said, why? And they said, because we care about what you think about it. We're concerned about, is there somewhere you see a need for improvement? Well, I was kind of blown away by that. Wasn't used to that. But I say that, number one, to illustrate the point, but also I say that to kind of brag on our elders because, a fellow appreciates that. That means something, somebody just to value your opinion. And that was very, very encouraging to me. But there's also a good illustration of worrying over something that never even happened. I think I'm going to go in here and I'm going to get in trouble or get fussed at, or you need to change this, you need to do that. And sometimes we do that, don't we? Maybe somebody calls you up and says, hey, I need to talk to you. Can we set up a time? And that's all they say. Look, I don't really want to get into it over the phone, but can we meet? And man, we just wring our hands, rack our brains, worry. And sometimes it's just nothing.
What if, Chad?
Do what?
Those two words, what if?
What if, yeah. Boy, we love what if scenarios, don't we? Some folks more than others again, but man, things that never happen, that's a big one. People worry a lot about money. Don't have enough money. Don't know how to use money. Of course, if you don't know how to use money, you'll never have enough money. And if you love money, you'll still never have enough money. How am I going to keep other people from taking my money away? How am I going to make my money grow into more money? Sometimes people worry about money, right? Really get themselves worked up. People worry about their physical appearance. I talked about this a while ago. Too fat, too skinny, too tall, too short. I got wrinkles. I got losing hair. This, that, the other. All kind of things that people worry about with their physical body and appearance. Look at Hollywood. It just, on the one hand, it makes me sad, and I pity people that have such a sad existence that they just worry over these things with appearance. On the other hand, it makes me just infuriated because especially when you look at so many people in our society that look to them and they want to know, well, tell me how I should vote. Tell me how I should think. Tell me what my morality should be. And it's just pathetic. But these people, they get so obsessed with looks, physical appearance. And just think of all the different surgeons and surgeries and procedures that are out there to help people that have just become obsessed and worried over physical appearance. Jesus, though, of course, he's the greatest teacher. He asks questions that make people think. He does this a lot in his teaching and his ministry on earth. And here he asks, in this context, he asks at least 5 questions discussing worry. And, of course, he uses these illustrations we talked about. They involve common matters, very easy illustrations. And it's kind of like Tim was pointing out a while ago. It's like Jesus says, you don't believe what I'm saying? Look at the birds. Are they going around starving to death? Look at the flowers. Are they worried about trying to look pretty? They just, if that happens with them, God's going to take care of you. So there's more to life than the physical matters of eating, wearing clothes, and things like that. Jesus wants us to be spiritually minded, trust in God. And Robert pointed that out. It's all about trusting in God. Jesus said not to worry. To worry is a sin. Don't confuse worry with concern. That's kind of the bottom line here. We have a great Heavenly Father, and He's going to take care of us. And when it comes to worry, let us not fall into this, well, everybody worries. Well, number one, that's not true, at least not in the sense of all the time. But number two, even if that were true, since when does that make anything okay, right? That's something, if you see that's an area that needs to be worked on, then work on it. One person said that he tells us not to worry because worry is inconsistent. Well, if you say you have faith in God, but then you're worrying, if I have faith in God and I'm His child, then I should have faith that He's going to take care of me, right? But if I'm worried all the time, do I really have faith? So you see the inconsistency there. It's ineffective. It doesn't accomplish anything. We talked about that a while ago with the worry ain't Rogaine. Somebody said worry doesn't rob tomorrow of its sorrow. It robs today of its strength. That's very true. Worry is, number 3, irrational. It's bad for you. It's inefficient. I mentioned this when I preached this sermon on this particular section of the Sermon on the Mount. There was a patient in a mental hospital. He was holding his ear close to the wall, listening very intently. And the nurse finally approaches and says, "Sir, what are you doing?" And he says, "Shh." He's got his ear against the wall, and he says to the nurse, come over here, listen. So she puts her ear to the wall and she listens. And she says, I don't hear anything. And you know what he says? I know, it's been like that all day. That's irrational. But isn't that how some people do with worry? I mean, you sit here and say, you've been worried about this, you've been worried about that, you've been worried about that, and these things didn't even happen. And a person who's just eat up with worry and they got this worrywart syndrome may look and say, well, that just means I'm due. I'm due for something bad to happen. That just makes my chances worse. That just gets into such irrational thinking. Number 4, it's idolatrous. Pagans worry. Gentiles, that's what he says in this context, not the sons of the king. How do I overcome worry? That's a good question to answer. I think what time is it? We're getting close to time. I wanted to, I was looking at the time. Thank you, Miss Gail. Leo Aikman penned the phrase that I mentioned a while ago, blessed is the man who is too busy to worry in the daytime and too sleepy to worry at night. Thank you very much. I wanted to give credit where credit was due there. So, looking at how to overcome worry. There's a lot we could say about this, but we need to slow down. We mentioned that already. Another illustration of that I've used before, that here's a man that worked on a barge on the Mississippi River. He was carrying something, fell overboard. He cried for help. Then he goes under. Man, he manages to get himself back up to the surface. It just barely comes and gets his head above water, and he cries out for help, and he goes under again. And he came up again one more time, just barely gets his head above water, and he says, somebody help me or I'm going to have to let one of these anvils go. Sometimes you just need to let something go. You know what? If you fall in the water and maybe you're carrying two big heavy things, a chain or something like that, or anvils or whatever it might be, and it's weighing you down and it's going to drown you, are you worried about that? Oh, I just bought that yesterday. I paid a lot of money for that. Or are you letting go and going to live? Sometimes we're hanging on to things that are just pulling us under and drowning us, right? I mean, how ridiculous would that be to say, I'm not letting that go, I paid too much for it, as you go down to the bottom of the ocean and die. And yet that's what we do sometimes when it comes to worry, right? We could also live one day at a time, just one day at a time. That goes back to Matthew 6, right, or the earlier part of the chapter, where he says what in the model prayer? Give us this day our daily bread. And there's a lesson there in that one day at a time. Trust God every day. When they got manna, it came every day, right? And if you decide, nobody knows what tomorrow holds, better get 2 days worth today. What happened? Bread worms and it stank. Of course, on Friday they did, because that was God's instruction, because they didn't gather on the Sabbath. It was a day of rest. He says, trust in me. I'm going to take care of you day by day. And so live one day at a time. Number 3, we could say keep a long-term perspective. Yes, there are things that happen in the short term that are not pleasant. There are things that are extremely difficult to get through, to navigate, to cope with. Death being one of the most difficult. But keep a long-term perspective. I love David's long-term perspective in 2 Samuel 12. What does he say? He loses a child there, and he says, well, I can't bring him back, but I'm going to go to him. That's a long-term perspective. We sometimes say that maybe at funerals or something like that. It's not goodbye, it's see you later, when it's a faithful Christian or someone who's right with God that dies, like a child who is safe. We can say, this isn't goodbye, this is see you later. Now it should be motivation for us. I say to people, the older I get and the more I say see you later on this side of eternity to some dear friends and people that mean a lot to me, mentors and things like that, heaven gets a little sweeter, seems like, all the time. And it's motivation to want to go there. So keep a long-term perspective. Number 4, remember God's faithfulness. God is faithful. We live in a fallen world. That happened when sin entered the world. It'll be that way until the end of time. And heaven is not, this earth is not home. Heaven is our home. But God's faithfulness doesn't change throughout all this. He's not zapping us with problems. He's not zapping us with difficulties. God is faithful. So I need to remember God's faithfulness when I'm tempted to worry. I need to put God first. And that's, again, verse 33 here. Put God first, and the peace of God that passes all understanding will keep our hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. It's not to try to oversimplify it, but those are just some tips to help us with worry. Worry is the perennial, perpetual challenge, is it not? Because there's so many things that'll get us off track in that arena if we allow them to. I know we're about to run out of time. I feel like there was something else. Okay, Papa's got some more here that I wanted to mention. I mentioned put God first, live one day at a time, plan for tomorrow, he says, but don't worry about it. He mentions a help for overcoming worry is to say, let God's will be done. James 4:15 mentions that, Go to now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go into such a city, buy, sell, get gain, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It's even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. For that you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. Well, learn to say, let God's will be done. He says, in any situation, do the best you can, leave the rest in God's hands. That's good advice. Take your problems, cares, desires to the Lord in prayer, casting all your cares upon Him, for He cares for you, 1 Peter 5:7. Be busy in the Lord's work. Let me ask you this as we close out. What were you worried about exactly 1 year ago today? 2 years? 10 years? Now, it may be that this happens to fall on the anniversary of some very significant event. But probably the vast majority of us in here, what is today, 10th, right? February 10th of last year. I don't know. I was probably worried about what we were going to eat for supper that night in Costa Rica. I think I was in Costa Rica this time last year. Most of the time worrying about things that in the grand scheme, with that long-term perspective, they don't really matter. They're not affecting us long-term. Some things will. Worry still doesn't change things, right? Robert, were you going to say something a while ago? About what? The hair loss.
In the book of Job makes a good statement. I can't remember right off the head, but I had it on.
Okay. Well, if you remember, write it down. I didn't mean to. I saw your hand up, and then I forgot and got busy talking and come back. But if you remember, write it down, and we'll come to it next week. Thank you very much. I kind of wanted to get into chapter 7, but I realized we weren't, so stopping at the end of chapter 6 is a good stopping point. We'll pick up, Lord willing, with chapter 7, verse 1. Talk about judging, man. People, if they don't know any verse in the Bible, they know Matthew 7:1, right? Judge not, that you be not judged. One of the most abused, misused verses in all Scripture. Thank you. We'll talk about it next week.